And I assume you have some sort of introduction in mind? Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Best Game Movies, period. Those of you that have listened to the show, the Best Games, period, are in for a treat because we are going to try something new and different and hopefully somewhat consistent. This is just Jack Gardner and I, Jeremy Brown. No Daniel Jones with us today, for better or worse. Most would say better. But what we're going to do during the show is talk about gaming-related movies, sometimes documentaries, sometimes actual movies.
Well, documentaries are actual movies.
Well, true. They're actually usually better movies than most game movies. I guess what I'm saying is sometimes it'll be like, full production theatrical releases, and sometimes it'll just be something you can find on Netflix, Hulu, or even maybe like a director's cut that comes with a special edition of a game. Who knows? We're kind of just getting started on this.
Jeremy, you just reminded me that the movie Noobs exists.
Yes.
And that might be a movie that has the possibility of coming up on this at some point.
It could.
Did you ever sit down and watch that movie?
No, I have enough pain in my life already, Jack. I watched the trailer and was sick to my stomach.
I, out of a morbid curiosity, tried to sit down and watch that one day. I got 20 minutes in, and it is just the worst. It is just completely terrible.
It just seems so stereotypical and cliche and not even funny that I just had no interest whatsoever.
Well, it was 10 years off of when it should have come out.
Yeah, exactly. Little late to the game.
But we're not talking about Noobs this week. This week we're actually talking about a good video game movie that I think a lot of people have seen.
Yeah.
I kind of go back and forth. Sometimes I'm like, oh, everyone knows what Indie Game the movie is. And then I'm like, well, it doesn't seem like everyone knows what Indie Game the movie is, so...
It seems like it kind of had a short window. Kind of like a lot of indie games. If you watched it when it first came out, you know what it is. If you didn't, it didn't have this big, huge marketing campaign. You wouldn't think about maybe watching it necessarily unless you just happen to stumble across it.
Yeah.
But I agree. It's a good video game movie, and I think I do think a lot of people watched it. In that first 6 months that it was released. When it was released, though, if I'm not mistaken, it was pretty much you had to go to their website, buy it from their website, and you could only watch it on their website, which may have hurt how many people watched it.
Indie Game the movie, when it released, there was so much hype around it. At least if in the insular gaming community, we're talking a lot about this movie.
Yeah.
Outside, probably not nearly as much. If you're relatively new to gaming since it came out, you probably haven't heard a ton about it. But as far as I know, Indie Game the movie is kind of the video game documentary. There are plenty of other video game documentaries and a few that came out before Indie Game the movie, but this was the one that at least as far as I know, this is the one that people were really paying attention to.
Well, it came out at a good time for it to come out, since it was relegated only towards indie games, and indie games were kind of blown up at that time. There were other video game documentaries, but it featured pretty much every game for the last 20 years in just short snippets, and more talking about the history of that game rather than getting real personal with the development of those games, which I think separates Indie Game the movie a little bit from the previous documentaries.
Yeah. And so this Indie Game the movie came out in 2012. It was directed by James Swirsky and Lizanne. Man, I'm so sorry to both of you because I'm probably butchering your names. Lisanne, Lisanne Pajot, Pajot.
I always thought it was Lisanne Pajot, but what do I know?
That's probably much more flattering and accurate. I'm terrible at reading names, but they put together this documentary that focuses on primarily four different indie developers. There's Edmund McMillan, Tommy Refens. Again, names are not my strong suit. I apologize. And both those two people make up the development team called Team Meat. They made Super Meat Boy. Then you got Phil Fish and Jonathan Blow. And Phil Fish developed Fez, and Jonathan Blow did Braid, and more recently, The Witness.
While we're talking about names, one of the things that struck me is they only mentioned Tommy's last name like once. And after that, they never did it again. But everybody else, they would constantly show their last name. And I've always been curious, even from when I watched it 5 years ago, I've been curious as to why that was.
Huh. I didn't notice that, but now that you mention it, yeah. It is kind of an odd thing.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if it was maybe by his request?
Maybe. He seems kind of like a little bit more... Well, they all seem a little bit reclusive in their own ways.
True.
In the documentary.
Especially in the first half hour, 45 minutes.
Yeah. This... So, the people that they chose to focus on for the documentary, it kind of makes a nice little... It gives the movie a nice structure. So you got Edmund McMillan and Tommy Refens. I'm so sorry. I'm probably getting your name wrong. I'm just going to call you Tommy. Just going to call him Tommy.
Yeah,
and
the movie
Tommy
did.
and Edmund. Tommy and Edmund are in the process of making Super Meat Boy, and the documentary follows them from being in the process of developing it through to when they actually released Super Meat Boy.
And of the four people you talked about, two of them are on the same team.
Right.
And basically there's three games. This Super Meat Boy was the only game that in the documentary that was actually kind of shown through development through to release.
Right.
Braid had already been released, and Fez had yet to come out at that point.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like the three stages of indie development. Like, you have the game that has come out and is critically acclaimed, and a developer who's speaking from that end of the spectrum. Then you have the developers who are working on their game and on the cusp of releasing it, and their perspective. And then you have Phil Fish, who's working on Fez, and his perspective from being in the middle of developing an indie game with no end in sight.
And I kind of have to think the film producers expected Fez to come out to a degree at some point during the time of the making of this documentary. But I think the fact that it didn't is able to separate those three things, and it made for a pretty good film in that regard, because you got to see all three different sides of that.
Yeah, it's... I often think that the best documentaries are the ones that kind of happen by accident.
Yeah.
Because, like, a lot of these things, like, the documentary filmmakers couldn't have planned. Like, they didn't know when they were filming how Super Meat Boy was going to turn out. Like, they didn't know if it was going to be a huge success or a flop or any of that. And they're filming, like, the day of release and capturing kind of what's going through these indie developers' heads and minds. As they're waking up in the morning, as they're reading the sales numbers that they've done so far, or like freaking out
because it's not on Xbox Live on the indie sale like it's supposed to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a really what I like about it is that it shows a side of game development that a lot of people never get to see. Because if you're in the gaming community, often you are seeing more of the PR / like games journalism think pieces and stuff like that, which like all those things have their own place, but oftentimes it's really difficult to get insight into what is happening on the developer end of things. Because it ends up getting filtered through like PR departments or sanded off in interviews or whatever.
Yeah, I was about to use that word filtered, except I was going to put "un" in front of it. It's completely unfiltered. These people just say whatever they want. And parts of that, sometimes that's kind of grating, but most of the time it works really well, and I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because as the years have gone by and I've gotten to I've become more familiar with the gaming industry and like how it works and developers. I think a lot of people, when Indie Game the movie came out, saw these people as pretentious. Like, oh, look at these guys, they're just making games and they're talking about feelings and like connecting with people. Oh gosh, they're just making a game. Why can't they shut up and make a game? And I think I think that attitude still certainly exists, but when I watched it this time, like, yes, at some points like Jonathan Blow can come off as pretentious, or Phil Fish says stuff that you're like, well, that's pretty hyperbolic.
Well, but Phil Fish has said so much more hyperbolic stuff and worse stuff since this movie's come out that he actually looks pretty... I mean, I empathize with him in this movie now.
Yeah, I mean, like, this movie is all about trying to get you to understand the perspective of someone who has put everything on the line to develop an indie game. Like, these people literally are running out of money, and if these games fail, they have no idea what they're gonna do with their lives. Phil Fish, at one point in this documentary, says with quite a bit of conviction that if Fez fails, he is going to kill himself.
Yeah, that I didn't think that he was... Yeah, I took him serious.
Yeah. And
I mean, so I guess while we're talking about that sort of stuff, Edmund McMullen also compared the crunch time of finishing Super Meat Boy to being in a concentration camp. That kind of bugged me. So, yeah. Like the first time I watched this movie, I really did not like it. And then I watched the first half yesterday, and I really did not like it again. But then when I watched... I rewatched the full thing today from the very beginning, and I suddenly like it.
What?
I'm getting there. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
There's clearly 2 or 3 years worth of footage here. This was not shot in a week.
No.
Like, the documentary team, really took their time to let this develop, I guess, so to speak.
Pun intended?
Yeah. And go through with it. Like, and looking back at the time, it was cool to make... It wasn't cool, but it wasn't as taboo to make concentration camp jokes in, 2009 when that comment was probably made. Whereas now, everybody would be way all over it. And again, like, Phil Fish seems completely reasonable in this thing. I mean, he does talk about where if his former partner shows up at PAX, he's going to cold blood kill him. But I didn't get the sense that he literally meant that in the same way that he meant when he said if Fez fails or doesn't come through, that he would kill himself. I mean, that seemed real. This just seemed more like an emotional response to like, and I still don't even know who this mysterious partner is. I'm sure I could Google it and find out if I really wanted to know. But
I think it was like a former friend who was basically financing the game.
But the thing is, in Fez's case, it was financed by the Canadian government, which is also interesting.
Yeah, at least in part.
In part, yeah.
I know Canada and I think also Australia have government funds that go towards, and I'm sure other countries too. I just know that Canada and Australia have these programs that fund like game development or technology development and stuff like that. So
my sense is the grant folded when the partner backed out. That's kind of the gist I got from watching the movie.
And the movie builds up that this has been an ongoing problem between the two of them, because the first time he mentions his partner backing up, there isn't that amount of anger.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is like, well, they're at this big event. They're at a PAX, Penny Arcade Expo event, and they're supposed to be building their booth to set it all up, but he doesn't know if he can actually legally do that until his partner signs one more document, and his partner is being very vague about if he'll show up or not, and so did
it ever even say if he signed it? I mean,
I think they did. Yeah.
He talked with his new partner, and his new partner was like, "Yes, we shook hands and we agreed," and blah 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 blah.
There was a scene, I think, where like someone came in and was like, "He's here," and so they signed that paperwork off. They had to do it off screen because I don't think the partner agreed to be in the film. But
so the poor guy, he gets that fixed, and then the game crashes every time somebody plays it. That had to be rough.
Yeah. And so like these people have so much riding on the line, like in tangible real world terms, but they also have a lot riding on the line in terms of just being an artist, which I think often gets lost a lot in conversations about indie games because people are so focused on the money aspect and like, oh, this is how much money you made, you're super rich. And it was, to me, it's super interesting hearing them talk about that aspect because, like, especially in Edmund McMillan's case, he's talking about how these games are a way for him to, like, communicate with other people and, like, find other people who are like him or communicate something to other people who are like him. I personally find him a very interesting game maker between Super Meat Boy and The Binding of Isaac. And then you have Jonathan Blow, who's talking about the same thing, but in very different terms. And I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but Jonathan Blow is one of those developers that a lot of people like to point to as being like more cold and mechanically minded, as it were, and being more pretentious. And I don't think that is an accurate assessment of him as a person at all.
I would say as a whole, no, but some of that I think is true.
Well, so I think he comes off. Yeah, I think he comes off that way a lot in his interviews and stuff like that. But I think that his mind works slightly differently than a lot of people's, and so he thinks about things in different ways. And there's a part in this documentary that kind of, I think, gets at that, and it's where he's talking about how he was disappointed because people kept in his estimation, people kept missing the main messages or points of Braid and what he wanted to communicate with the game. And I think, I mean, that's probably still true. Like, I think a lot of his disappointment was in finding that there were not very many people who connected with the game the same way he did.
Well, from what I understand, by all accounts, Jonathan Blow is already pretty well off financially. So that's not so much a concern to him. And I don't know how he is or if that's even true, but that's kind of been my understanding.
I don't know if that was true before Braid.
I think it was.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he'd been making video games for 22 years before that.
Yeah.
And I kind of think his family has money, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah. And I understand what you're saying. He was talking about, I don't care if I get 9s or 10s, the vast majority of the time, the people are missing the point of what was my game and what I intended it to be, and they kind of referenced that Soulja Boy video a couple of times. I guess the issue I take with that is that's really not his place to say. I understand how he feels.
Yeah. But
let people enjoy the game the way that they're going to enjoy the game, and that's maybe the biggest issue I've always had with Jonathan Blow is he makes some pretty in-depth, outside-of-the-box type of games. And I think he's brilliant. I think he's probably a legitimate genius, right?
Yeah.
And you can't expect people to look through the same eyes and see the same things in exactly the same way, especially with the very little context you give them within that game. So I just feel like he should kind of roll with it.
I agree, but that's also where I'm thinking that his brain operates differently than most people's, and that's probably part of what makes him brilliant.
Exactly.
But it's also one of the things that makes him feel isolated when people aren't understanding the thing he made the same way he understands it.
I don't discount his emotion as being insincere or ungenuine.
Yeah.
I just have a hard time relating to not being happy with the product that you put out when it's so successful. I mean, Braid sold 10,000 units on its first day in 2008.
Something like that.
Super Meat Boy. And that was, literally the very beginning of downloadable indie games. It wasn't much of a thing before then. And
it was Castle Crashers and I don't know what else.
Castle Crashers was after that still. Yeah. And Super Meat Boy did, they did 22,000 units, but this was 4 years or 3 years after that, and people had embraced indie games in large part because of Braid. And Jonathan Blow's been kind of silent the last several years, and I'm not saying that's good or bad. I think he probably is at a place now where maybe he can appreciate what his game did, even though people didn't appreciate what the game did that he wanted them to appreciate at the time. We've talked about Braid several times on the Best Games period in different contexts, and it's a puzzling game, pun intended once again. It's hard to make rhyme or reason out of it, and clearly in his mind he knew exactly what that game was meant to be and what it wanted to be. Yeah. And he could probably read every single forum, every single review, and never find somebody that has the same mindset as him. And it seems to me that that's what he was searching for during the filming of this documentary. He could be completely different by now. Who knows?
Yeah. I think it just spoke to a really lesser, not lesser, but an aspect of making a game that, again, I don't think a ton of people think about when they think of indie devs. That ties in with public reaction to these people as figures instead of as people. Each of these developers kind of has a different take on it. So Jonathan Blow is talking about how people didn't really get his game in the way he wanted it to, but it was an addicting thing to look at all this public reaction.
I actually admire him for admitting that.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Well, and then you have the Super Meat Boy team, who didn't really go super in depth on this part of it, but they're talking about how, like, people reach out to them and are, like, trying to get free stuff from them, and
well, and also as far as the, when the game released, they were terrified to even read anything. I mean, it was like these polar opposites.
Yeah, and then you have Phil Fish, who's I have a personal fascination with Phil Fish.
I think we all do.
Yeah,
maybe for different reasons, but yeah.
But it's really interesting looking back on this movie. It came out just 5 years ago, and probably footage from like 2011, maybe 2010. And Phil Fish is talking about how people are literally wishing him, like, sending him death threats and telling him how much they hate him because he's making an indie game that is taking a couple years.
Yes, because he's making a game that they desperately want to play. Like, right. What?
Well, but not only that, like, the entire, like, I think the turnaround from when Fez went into development to when it came out was only a few years. Yeah. like he won an award, like the game won an award for its visual design, and it wound up bringing him all this attention, which I guess initially at least was good, but people got mad it was taking so long to make. And thinking about that in today's terms, where we've gotten games like The Last Guardian or Final Fantasy 15 that literally took like decades to make, like over a decade to make, and then thinking that and those games had, and he mentions, he compares Fez to like Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption, and those are games
5 years to develop and whatnot. Yeah.
But that they also had teams of like
1,000
over 1,000 people. And you also have games like The Last Guardian, who probably had teams in the hundreds working on them, and they still took almost a decade or over a decade to make. But people aren't sending, or at least not a lot of people are sending death threats to Sony about those games, or Square Enix.
Or, I mean, maybe if they are, like, they're just sending them to so many different random people, they don't even know who to send them to, so it never gets, like, it's not as personal.
Right, and with Phil Fish, like, even
he was the only one, so they all came right to him.
Right, and even before his first game came out, he's getting death threats and people telling them how much they hope he dies, or, nasty, profanity-laced statements. And it's just, like, that has to play into affecting you on a personal level. Like, when the internet is so open at targeting you, there's no way you can just, like, grow a thicker skin and deal with it. Especially if you're someone who is like Phil Fish. And so, this is outside the scope of the documentary, but it makes perfect sense to me how he would go on to just say very incendiary things and attract more attention to himself, and just kind of get into this death spiral with the image that at least people who are willing to go after other people on the internet are attracted to.
Yeah.
'Cause I think the image of Phil Fish in this documentary is probably fairly accurate. I don't think he's a monster, and I don't think he's like a terrible person either. I think he's a human, and he has a ton of great qualities that allow him to make something as amazing as Fez.
I think he's just highly emotional. Like, he's passionate.
And
sometimes
passionate.
That works for you, and sometimes that works against you. Like, you could see him once he finally got the game to run somewhat consistently at PAX. Like, he was elated. He was, like, sitting there talking to the people, like, yeah. And then when the dude from Penny Arcade, Taicho, whatever his name is, came up, like, he was, like, suddenly a fanboy. He was like, oh, my God, this is the greatest thing ever. Yeah, I have a...
I just have a lot of sympathy.
I have a
for the
cautiously optimistic respect for Phil Fish, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have gone through phases. Like, here's the thing. Like, we're talking about Phil Fish as almost like more of a concept than a person. And I think that's kind of the thing that really, really undermines indie game developers, because a lot of people think of them as these abstract ideas rather than people.
Yeah.
And so I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this tangent, but all I'm saying is I think a lot of people hate the idea that they have built up in their heads of Phil Fish rather than Phil Fish as an actual person.
Well, let's think of it this way. Fez eventually did release.
Yep.
It was a great game.
Yep.
And through all that adversity, he still managed to pull it off. That says something, because the guy clearly, like I said, I think he's highly reactive. I think he's very emotional, and I can somewhat relate to those things. I think that he still did it. I don't think we've seen or heard the end of Phil Fish yet. I mean, he did make that infamous tweet that, what did he say? Gamers are garbage, gamers are nothing, something like that. Like,
I don't know. He was getting targeted for...
And he was. And,
yeah.
You know, if I was being targeted, I could see myself making some sort of statement like that.
Yeah.
He's also smart enough to know to withdraw himself at that point and maybe regroup. Maybe he never comes back. Who knows?
Yeah.
But there's no denying that Fez is pretty much a masterpiece. And it belongs up there with not just indie games, but all games, as being a game that was probably extremely hard to develop for an entire team. For 2 people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and, like, it just as another slight side note, like, a lot of the things you've probably, if you haven't spent a lot of time, like, looking into the things Phil Fish has said, you're probably only getting, like, clips and snippets. Like, there's a infamous, like, and I guess infamous story about how he said all Japanese games suck, or something like that. And, like, that's not entirely true. That was, like, one sentence out of, like, a huge thing he was saying during an event. But that's the sentence that a lot of people ran with to cover the story.
Yeah.
And make him into a story. And that generated a lot of hatred for him, because a lot of people love Japanese games.
I love Japanese games. But yes, the entire context was rarely written about, and if it was, nobody cared at that point.
Right, because the story and damage had already been done,
yeah.
Even if it wasn't the whole story.
Correct.
But, so anyway, it's interesting to see him before all of that happened, still getting a lot of hatred for having the audacity to make a game that people think looks good.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, honestly, his biggest mistake was showing it at, what was it, GDC 2008 or whatever?
Yeah, something like that.
And then, promising a 2010 release date. Like, it was all downhill from there.
Yeah, so, and this, obviously, this movie is about a lot more than just Phil Fish. It's just, he's a magnetic personality, and it's because of that passion, and he's just easy to talk about and a really interesting character and person. But Indie Game the movie is a lot more than just Phil Fish. Like, I think one of the things that I found really interesting about it was seeing Tommy's life, or Tommy and Edmund's life, because both of them got together and put like everything they have on the line to try and finish Super Meat Boy. And like Tommy seems to like he's living in his parents' house. Is that the impression you got?
I more got the impression that his parents were paying for his apartment, but
Something
he
like
still had a room in his parents' house.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to say, like, and this is not to take away from any of these people. I mentioned Jonathan Blow already. Like, it seems like he had the means to be able to do this. Tommy, he mentioned he had the support of his parents, and they were going to give him whatever he needed to see this thing through. Edmund, I'm not so sure about Edmund. You know, I think he kind of was really struggling. But it makes, I guess the point is that these people had the ability to make these games because they had the support of their friends, family, and loved ones. Like, I could not just set out and make an indie game on my income. There's no way that would happen. Like, I couldn't dedicate the time.
Yeah.
These people are pretty fortunate.
People do Kickstarters.
Yeah, but this was before Kickstarter. You know.
Right. Well, I don't know.
It was before Kickstarter was huge. Indie Game, the movie itself, was a Kickstarter, yes.
Yeah.
But the games were not.
Right. I think you're right in that they were all fortunate enough to have some kind of position that they could leverage to get at least some initial funding. But like, it's pretty clear in the documentary that they're not in the best circumstances.
No,
like,
they're not. They're not rich beyond their wildest means. Maybe with the exception of Jonathan Blow, because that's never made real clear. But like even Edmund, like when he's talking about like his wife's like, man, I really want to buy this cat, but we can't until the game comes out and hopefully it sells. Like, that's real stuff.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and Tommy's talking about how he can't afford anything better than like a microwave sandwich in the morning.
But no, he also talks about he can go out and he can buy his own food. He just can't take people out on dates, and he can't pay off his parents' house yet. And those are the things that hurt him. I don't think he's hurting financially. I think
in the background, though, he's also a diabetic.
Yeah, insulin is expensive.
Yeah, like I have to imagine that between making a game, like dedicating all your resources to making a game, and also paying for insulin and an apartment and food, like, he's probably not in the best of shape.
So
financially,
I don't know this. Maybe you do. So when somebody strikes a deal with XBLA or PSN or whatever, do they get any sort of advance, like a book deal sort of thing?
They can. It really depends. Sometimes the publisher, well, it depends on the kind of game you're making, I guess. So if you're making like an indie game that you're trying to bring to a console, you might get an advance if you make it like an exclusive. You might get an advance if it's like a super hyped up game and you do a timed exclusive. But it is rarer for a game that might also be coming out on PC to get like, you're not going to get a $60 million advance like some people do in book deals. I mean, you might get what, 10 grand, something like that. Yeah, depending on like how valuable the publisher sees your project as being.
And when you're a startup, which of course, I mean, all these people had made games before this, but just basically on their own time out of boredom. Like, these were the first, speaking specifically of Team Meat, this was the first game that they had made for mass release. So I bet you they didn't. I bet you they didn't get a whole lot of support until the game was pretty much really close to done.
Well, and they were fortunate in that they created So they were actually fortunate in that Super Meat Boy had essentially a prototype. It was just called Meat Boy, and it was an internet flash game. And you see a little bit of it in the documentary. But that works as like a proof of concept. Like, this is what we're doing. We're just going to do more of it and bigger, and it'll be prettier. Where I'm kind of confused is how Fez managed to get all of its funding, because Phil Fish didn't have any real experience or even like a proof of concept, really, from what I can tell, until that the game won that award. Like,
well, he did have some experience. Him and his dad made some games,
right,
back in the day. And also, this is Canada, so it's different. I do not mean that as a slight. Yeah. I think it would be awesome if, instead of spending money to see how cow farts react to jet engines, I'd love to see more money go towards the arts here in this country.
To be honest, though, wouldn't you want to see those experiments? I know I'd want to see video of scientists making a cow fart into a jet engine.
See the end result? I don't know that I want to pay for it.
That sounds like a great YouTube channel.
But how much money did he get from the Canadian government? It's out there. It's either $200,000 or $2 million. I don't know. It's one or the other. I'm gonna guess the lower end, $200,000, and so he got that to start. But as Phil is going to be Phil, he got way, way over ambitious, which turned out to be a good thing in the long run, right? So, he had funding that, going back 12, 15 minutes in this conversation, my point was they all had some sort of funding. Some sort of, like, they didn't really have to, cook fries at McDonald's during the day and then burn the midnight oil to make these games. There was some sort of, I don't want to say privilege there, but they had opportunity that not everybody has. I bet you there's a ton of Phil Fishes out there. A ton of Edmund McMullins. These guys just kind of hit that lottery, but they still had a lot of struggles. I'm not discounting that.
Yeah. And I think you can design a game part-time, but I think a lot of people hit a point when they're making a game, at least it's something I've noticed in like the indie world, is a lot of people hit a point where they need to start doing it full-time. Yeah. Otherwise, it doesn't come together right, or it just comes out kind of half-baked.
Yeah. And, we're kind of seeing that now. Like, all the indie games that are coming out now that are just amazing, they owe a lot of their success to, and obviously Fez and Braid and Super Meat Boy weren't the first ever indie games. In fact, all of those people had made several indie games themselves before that. But, like, that kind of created the hysteria. Those three games and Castle Crashers behind, and Limbo behind the indie game scene. And suddenly we're all looking for a cheap $10, $15 game to buy on XBLA or PSN or Steam that's like just amazing. And it doesn't have to, have the best graphics in the world. It doesn't have to last 97 hours. It doesn't have to have the most in-depth characters. It just has to be fun, consistent, clean meaning gameplay-wise,
yeah,
and accessible.
Yeah, because like one of the things that motivated at least Edmund McMillan was being able to make a game that specifically wasn't clean.
The C word?
Not related to gameplay. By the way, I looked it up. The total amount that Phil Fish got from Canada to make his game was $73,682.
Oh, well, that's not that much, really.
Not when you're looking at 3 to 4 years of development time.
Yeah, plus equipment, and even then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm sure they're not hurting now.
No. None of these people seem to be about the money. Like they all said, even Jonathan Blow, when he was talking about Brady, is like, I don't really care if it sells well. Phil Fish is like, I don't really care if it sells well. I just want people to like it. Team Meat were like, Team Meat were like, yes, we kind of need it to sell well, but really I'm making this game for me, and if it doesn't, oh well.
Yeah, they were basically saying, if it doesn't do the best, that's okay. We only need X amount to make our next game.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny in retrospect because they haven't made any games together. They haven't made any games since.
They didn't both work on The Binding of Isaac?
Nope. I think they split up to kind of just do their own thing. They're still Team Meat is still a thing. They were planning on making a game called Mewgenics, which was about like genetically modified cats. It looked really adorable and cute. But that game got put on an indefinite hiatus for, I think, like about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And now they're working on something called Super Meat Boy Forever, which looks like maybe randomly generating Super Meat Boy level thing.
Okay.
Kind of combining that roguelike element from The Binding of Isaac with Super Meat Boy.
Okay.
But it also might be like Android and iOS type game, so I'm not sure if it's like a...
Well, the technology has changed so much since any of these games have come out. Who knows what they're going to do?
Yeah.
Freaking Phil Fish could make a new Rubik's Cube for all I know. Which would actually be kind of cool.
Yeah. It was also interesting, and at least in this documentary, it was interesting to see the pundits that they got to come on and just talk about public reaction, critical reaction to these games and kind of their place in society. Like, I totally forgot that Anthony Carboni was in Indie Game the movie.
So he's
featured pretty heavily.
Here's the thing about this movie.
Yep.
It's almost like it's two separate movies because the first, say, 40 minutes are completely depressing and full of these pundits that are just like, "Rrr." And the second half is like...
that are just like, what?
Rrr.
They're
not necessarily negative, but they're like pointing out the things that other people said were bad about these games potentially. And the second half takes you on this journey where it's like mostly successful. It's completely different. So if you're going to watch a movie, watch the whole movie. And I kind of I was talking to you and Daniel about this on Messenger last night. I watched the first half and I was like, oh my God, this is the most depressing thing. You guys are all arrogant, blah, 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 blah. But then...
Oh, so you were talking about the pundits and stuff?
I was talking about all of it. Even I was talking about the Jonathan Blow. I was talking about Phil Fish. Okay. I was talking about Edmund. I was talking about whatever his name is, Johnny. Tommy. But then it does that thing where things start to look up. Things start to get better. And at the end, for the most part, it's all good. You don't really see those pundits in the second half of the movie very much. Did you notice that?
No. Yeah, they were there to provide some initial context, I think. It might be interesting because I would like to do... There's a follow-up movie called, I think, Indie Game the Movie Aftermath?
Yep, I'm going to watch it.
Or After Years... Something
After
like that.
Something or another.
Yeah. And I think it's a bunch of extras that are interviews that didn't make it into the final film, or also just following up with these same developers years later. And I've never seen it, so I'm interested to see what that's all about.
Well, we could check it out and talk about it on a future episode.
Yeah, I'd be down. Like I said, it's just fascinating to be able to see indie developers in their natural habitats without kind of a PR filter.
That
is
the best part.
Yeah. Like they're talking about actual problems that are on their minds, not like how, oh man, I'm worried level 2 where you get the Blood Reaver sword, how, completely amazing that's going to be. Yep. Wink, hint, hint, buy my game.
Yeah, there's no lawyers or PR people whispering in their ear during their interviews. They're just saying how they feel. Yeah. And you got to respect that.
Yeah. And like you were kind of mentioning this in our discussion beforehand just a little bit, but like documentaries do have an angle. Like it's not just like we like to think of documentaries as just the facts and
just the raw footage, man.
a lot of times they're edited in ways to make us like think or like empathize with people or emphasize certain topics. Mm-hmm. You really get the impression that this movie was really just going for the developer's side of the story, and like I'm sure there was like some manipulation to get it to seem more like a narrative of like these underdogs coming together and getting these awesome games done or something like that.
I mean, I still think that happens in this movie. I think they just use the first half to show, like, they talk about their childhoods and all these terrible things that have happened to them. But then they show that success part. And I don't think any of those things are untrue. Clearly, I think the developer, the producers of the film knew exactly what they were doing there.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's misconstrued or put in a light that's untrue. Yeah. I think it's just good filmmaking.
Yeah, yeah. And you're right, it is kind of an uplifting movie, because even though these people are like struggling to have their messages heard and understood and to make a good game that people like and can relate to, there was no guarantee when they went into this project that that's how these things would turn out.
Yeah. And again, I think they filmed this over probably 2.5 years. Like, yeah. They took a gamble themselves. They didn't know.
The way this movie turned out, to me, is just so special because there are so many indie games that are made, so many that implode or have problems or, come out and they're just okay. But this movie managed to focus on 3 of the most important indie games that came out in the past decade.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's made with really good filmmaking, and I don't think it would be nearly as good if it was a movie about 2 Braid and 2 failed indie games.
Yeah.
Where everything ends up terribly and everyone's sad.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so I kind of need to wind down, Jack. Or leave, I guess I should say.
Well, how do we want to close this out?
That's what I'm asking. Do we do the thing where we decide if it's the best game movie period, or do we just?
Should we just go with? Should you watch this? Is it worth your time?
Yeah, I think so.
Because I don't know if it's like I don't know if it's the best game movie period. Yeah. But yeah, like I don't know if this is a best game movie period. I don't think that's what this show, this spin-off thing is going to be about. I think it's just going to be, is this movie worth your time? And this indie game movie is hands down, I think, a movie where if you are interested in the gaming industry at all, or want to show someone, a movie that shows indie games are important or can express things about human beings in a meaningful way, I think Indie Game the movie is hands down one of the first movies I would turn to show someone who didn't know anything about games or yeah.
Well, as a huge fan of documentaries in general and video games in general, I think it's definitely worth a watch. There's no real reason not to. It's, it's no Ken Burns film. It doesn't take 8 hours to finish. God bless Ken Burns, love him. And it gives you a lot of really good insights into not early indie game development, but that next level of indie game development that has brought us to where we are now with indie games. Like now, indie games are just a thing. Like people are like, oh hey, it's just another game. Cool, I get it. But there were some growing pains, and I think these games take us through some of those growing pains. And I appreciate that movie for that.
Yeah, 100%. So go watch Dang Blab Indie Game the movie, and listen to us next week maybe.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not.
So, just to close out this episode, you should go sign up for Extra Life. We always talk about Extra Life. It's a fantastic charity where people basically get together and play games and help raise money for sick and injured kids in Children's Miracle Network hospitals all across the United States and Canada. Each person who signs up can actually choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital they want to support, and 100% of all the money that they raise goes directly to that hospital. It's really wonderful. You can learn more over on extra-life.org. And you can also go to the community and get more involved in the Extra Life online community over on community.extra-life.org, where you can find our main podcast on the weekly. We're still kind of figuring out this spin-off series. We're going to be putting this one up just for general listeners of the Best Games period. We're going to be putting this one up. We may or may not put the other ones up for general listening, but you can also find this over on our Patreon at patreon.com/bestgamesperiod. These movie episodes and discussions will probably be for our $1 backers and above. So if you want to help us continue doing this show and we're really just looking to cover our costs, you can throw us $1 every month and listen to these fun movie discussions that we're going to be having. So let us know what you think over on Twitter at bestgamesperiod. And we'll see you next week. Right?
On the flippity dippity.
On the flippity dippity.
We will.
Do we want? Will these be on Saturdays? Maybe.
Hey, I mean that's your call.
We'll see about doing things on Saturdays.
It's going to be some day of the week. I can guarantee that.
Yes, it will be one of the days of the 7. It won't be the 8th day of the week. It won't be the 8th day.
No Gregorian calendar though. We're keeping with what we know.